Welcome to Yellowstone Story. Every story holds a lesson, a twist, or a spark of inspiration. Here, we dive into gripping tales, some heartwarming, some shocking, but all unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let's begin. I sat by the window, browsing job listings for a family chef position. My smartphone, though not new but still fully functional, had been a gift from my boarding school for my excellent grades. Thanks to it, I had learned so much and was able to train as a chef. Now, stepping into adult life, I needed to solve two problems at once, finding both a job and a place to live. That's why I was looking for positions that included accommodation. There were so many offers that it was hard to decide. In the end, I concluded that working for a family with small children would be the best option, but definitely not with teenagers or adults. I enjoyed this life, even though I had very little free time. Sundays were my only day off, and I used them to call my friends from the orphanage. We would meet at a cafe, talk about life, and reminisce about the past. One day, Kyle's nanny fell ill, and both Nina and I were assigned to look after him. It turned out that he was a very bright and talkative child, constantly asking questions, especially about food. His biggest fascination was with cupcakes, his favorite treat. Eventually, I had to show him the entire baking process. Sitting on a kitchen stool, swinging his legs, Kyle eagerly ate the warm cupcakes with jam. With absolute confidence, he announced that when he grew up, he would become a chef like me and asked if I would teach him. His childlike sincerity was heartwarming. I always tried to finish my tasks quickly so I could spend more time talking with him. He already knew almost everything about me, where I lived, where I washed my hands, when I went to bed. Perhaps he sensed that I was still almost a child myself. One day, after looking at me thoughtfully for a moment, he suddenly asked, "Where is your mom?" I gently stroked Kyle's head and quietly replied, "I don't have a mom, and I never did." He looked at me in surprise. "Then where did you come from?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Then, as if remembering something, he lowered his head and softly added, "I had a mom, but now I don't," he said. I froze, watching him closely. He spoke with such seriousness that an uneasy feeling crept over me. Could it be that Margaret wasn't his real mother? I decided to ask Nina about it, but before I could, the sound of the front door opening caught Kyle's attention. As soon as his parents returned, he ran to them, shouting happily, "Dad! Mom!" I let out a quiet sigh of relief. Children his age often make up stories, I told myself, and brushed the thought aside. A few days later, I witnessed a strange scene. It was a Saturday evening. Stephen had gone out alone, leaving Margaret at home. Unexpectedly, she brought Kyle into the kitchen and told me to watch him because she had to leave urgently. As usual, Kyle climbed onto his favorite stool. Margaret went to the garage, started the car, and drove away. Suddenly, Kyle jumped down from the stool, ran to the large window, and angrily shook his little fist several times in the direction of the departing car. I gently stopped him. "Kyle, that's not how you should behave toward your mom." The reaction was instant and shocking. He suddenly screamed, then threw himself at me in a fit of hysteria, clinging to me as he sobbed uncontrollably. Through his tears, he kept repeating that Margaret was not his mother, that he didn't want to call her that, but his father forced him to. His small body trembled as he buried his face in my apron. I had no idea how to comfort him. His pain felt far too deep for a 5-year-old child. Then, I thought of the one thing that always made him happy. I suggested that we bake cupcakes together, and Kyle immediately lifted his tear-filled eyes to me. His voice was weak and shaky, but he agreed. Gently, I wiped his face and took a glass mixing bowl from the cupboard. We needed to pour in the milk, add eggs and sugar. As he focused intently on the process, I hoped it would help him forget his distress, even if just for a little while. Before long, Margaret returned, leaving the car parked by the porch as she stepped into the house. Stephen then instructed me to pack Kyle's bag, as he was going to spend the night at a friend's country house. It marked the end of another eventful day in the house, one filled with both challenges and joyful moments. Even something as simple as baking had turned into a little adventure. Margaret went upstairs while I took Kyle to his room to pack his things. Carefully, I folded a change of clothes, a pajama set, and a warm tracksuit into his backpack. Suddenly, he reminded me about his slippers, and I quickly added them to the bag. As soon as everything was ready, Kyle grabbed the backpack and, filled with excitement, dashed down the stairs. I rushed after him, but he was too fast. Running out onto the porch, he jumped straight onto the driveway behind the car. At that exact moment, Margaret, already in the driver's seat, suddenly reversed. It all happened in a split second. If I hadn't managed to catch up and push him aside, he could have ended up under the wheels. Kyle tumbled onto the stone pavement, scraping his knee, and burst into tears. I knelt beside him, trying to soothe him, when Margaret jumped out of the car. Without hesitation, she started yelling, blaming me for not watching the child, insisting that she hadn't even seen him behind the car. But then, unexpectedly, Kyle stopped crying. It was as if he suddenly realized that I was taking the blame for him. Saying nothing, he reached out his hand and let Margaret buckle him into the car seat. Just before the door closed, he turned back and blew me a silent kiss. With a cold tone, Margaret told him to sit still, and then they drove away. I returned to the kitchen, where Nina was preparing dinner for the household staff. Taking a deep breath, I tried to steady my trembling hands. My heart nearly stopped, I said, sinking into a chair. These little ones are so quick, you have to watch them constantly to keep them safe. Nina responded thoughtfully, mentioning that something similar had happened in her hometown, except in that case, a 1-year-old child had died. Her story lingered in my mind. A father had accidentally run over his own child, not only losing him but also ending up in prison. The weight of that tragedy made me reconsider what had just happened with Kyle. Margaret was not an inexperienced driver. She couldn't have mistaken the pedals. Did that mean she had done it on purpose? A chill ran down my spine at the thought. I decided I would keep a close eye on her. Later, Nina confirmed my suspicions. Margaret was not Kyle's biological mother. That explained a lot. I knew that wealthy people were unlikely to be kind to me. After making several calls, I was left with 2 options. One family consisted of 3 adults, a husband, wife, and elderly mother, along with 3 small children. The other had only 2 adults and a 5-year-old child. The first house greeted me with strict formality. A maid led me to the hostess, who immediately assessed me from head to toe. After the weekend, Stephen called me into his office. His expression was tense, his posture rigid. It turned out that Kyle had told him everything. Through tears, he had claimed that Margaret had tried to run him over. I tried to explain that I couldn't say for certain whether it was intentional, but one thing I knew for sure, Kyle didn't want to call Margaret his mother. He only did it because he was forced to. I could see that Stephen was processing my words. Regret flashed in his eyes. He admitted that he had hoped for something else, that Kyle was still too young and would eventually adjust. I told him that children perceive their mother as an inseparable part of themselves, and such feelings cannot be forced. Stephen looked defeated. He realized that his attempts to create the illusion of a family had only worsened the situation. He now had a serious conversation ahead with his son. The next day, he called me in again. I already had a feeling that this conversation would be just as difficult. When I entered the office, Margaret was already there. She barely glanced at me before turning toward the open window, exhaling cigarette smoke. A tense silence filled the room. Stephen hesitated before speaking, but the sharp look from his wife forced him to begin. Stephen asked if I had seen Kyle's tablet when I was packing his backpack. I recalled that the device had indeed been on the table. Kyle often watched cartoons and played games on it. I nodded affirmatively. He continued, stating that no one else had entered the nursery after me, yet now the tablet was missing. His words felt like an accusation. A sharp jolt ran through me. I couldn't believe that anyone seriously thought I was a thief. Emotions boiled inside me, but I held them back, nearly covering my mouth with my hand to stop myself from saying something rash. Noticing my reaction, Stephen suggested checking my room, just in case the tablet had ended up there by mistake. I didn't argue. Calmly, I pulled out my key and placed it on the table in front of him. He frowned, clearly not expecting such a response. He tried to reassure me that no one was accusing me of anything, that this was just a way to clear things up. Then, with a gesture, he indicated for me to follow him. Without a word, I complied. Of course, the tablet wasn't in my room, but unexpectedly, it was found in the kitchen. At the time, Nina and Kyle were there. The device had been placed inside the drawer for kitchen towels. As soon as Kyle saw his missing tablet, he let out a shriek of excitement and began jumping around the kitchen. He kept shouting that it had been found, his joy filling the room. Stephen turned to me with a questioning look, clearly expecting an explanation. I remained silent, my mind racing through the events of that evening, trying to understand how the tablet had ended up in a kitchen drawer. I vividly remembered packing Kyle's backpack. After he had left with Margaret, I had tidied up the nursery before heading to the kitchen, where I had dinner with Nina. We talked for a bit before going to our rooms. The next day, the owners returned. Margaret went straight upstairs, while Stephen played with his son outside. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became the tablet had been planted intentionally. Everything pointed to Margaret, but I had no proof, so I simply stated that I hadn't taken it. Kyle, overhearing the conversation, suddenly turned around. Seeing that I was being accused, he immediately shouted that I was good and could never steal anything. Then, to my surprise, he declared that it was Margaret who had taken the tablet. She instantly tried to cut him off, but Kyle wouldn't back down. His voice trembled with frustration, as he insisted that he had seen her take the tablet after putting him to bed. He had been awake the whole time. Stephen remained silent, but his face turned red. The tension in the kitchen grew heavier with each passing second. Without another word, he picked up Kyle and swiftly left the kitchen. Margaret hurried after them, desperately trying to explain herself. She claimed she had only taken the tablet to charge it somewhere else, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing. They disappeared upstairs, and soon, Stephen's voice echoed through the house, firm and final, declaring that the discussion was over. A moment later, the study door slammed shut with force. For a few minutes, the house fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Margaret's muffled sobs behind the closed door. She kept accusing her husband of believing everyone but her. After some time, she reappeared in the kitchen, but her face was twisted with rage. Her eyes burned with resentment as she launched into a bitter tirade against me. She claimed that before I arrived, their home had been peaceful, that Kyle used to call her Mom, and now he treated her like she was untouchable, as if she were some kind of outcast. I didn't respond. It was clear that her anger wasn't truly directed at me. It came from something much deeper. Suddenly, Margaret strode to the refrigerator, yanked it open, and pulled out a bottle of vodka left over from the security guard's dinner. Without another word, she turned and walked away. About 30 minutes later, a loud crash erupted from upstairs. The sound of shattering mirrors, tumbling vases, and perfume bottles hitting the floor all blended into a chaotic clatter. Nina and I rushed upstairs. By the time we reached the bedroom, Stephen was already there, struggling to restrain Margaret. Her movements were wild, unnatural, aggressive, and unpredictable, as if she had lost all control. Margaret screamed incoherently, thrashing in Stephen's grip. She clawed at him, trying to bite, her behavior wild and uncontrolled, like she had completely lost her senses. Stephen, struggling to hold her back, shouted for us to call an ambulance. Nina immediately ran to the phone, while I instinctively stepped forward to help. But Margaret was consumed by some unnatural strength. Her movements erratic and frenzied, she stormed around the room, unable to calm down. Then, suddenly, her eyes locked onto me. Something shifted in her expression. Rage flared up in her features, and without warning, she lunged forward, sinking her nails into my shirt. The fabric tore with a sharp rip, exposing the black silk cord around my neck, the one holding my intricately carved cross. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Stephen, still restraining Margaret, suddenly stopped. His gaze fixed on the cross resting against my skin. An unrecognizable expression flashed across his face, a mix of shock, tension, and something deeper, something I couldn't quite understand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was strained. He asked where I had gotten that cross. I told him I had worn it since birth. At the orphanage, they had told me that my mother had placed it around my neck before giving me away. Stephen didn't take his eyes off me. His face grew pale. Then, with a sudden urgency, he turned sharply to Nina, reminding her about the ambulance. At that exact moment, the sound of screeching tires came from outside. The emergency vehicle had arrived. 2 paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, followed closely by a doctor. Assessing Margaret's condition quickly, the doctor injected her with a strong sedative. Within seconds, her body slackened, and she slowly collapsed to the floor. She looked at me with skepticism and asked my age right away. When I told her I was 19, she simply shook her head. I tried to explain that, although I had no experience working in private homes, I had cooked during my internship at a children's camp and at charity events. But she cut me off mid-sentence. She wasn't satisfied that I had worked in public catering rather than in a private household. She emphasized that an elderly woman with special dietary needs lived in their family, and I clearly wouldn't be a good fit. There was nothing left for me to do but say goodbye. Breathing heavily, Stephen sank onto the edge of the bed, pressing his fingers against his temples, as if trying to ward off an oncoming headache. A few moments passed before he finally muttered that with this kind of stress, he could end up in a mental hospital himself. Then, lifting his gaze to me, something in his expression had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but beneath it lay something firm, resolute. He said he wanted to show me something. We went downstairs, and he led me into his study. Opening a drawer, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound album and opened it to the very first page. Slowly, Stephen flipped through the pages, his eyes lost in memories. He explained that the album had been kept by his first wife, Iris, Kyle's mother. They had been classmates since the 4th grade, and from the moment she transferred to his school, he had noticed her. Over time, their friendship grew into something more. One night, at his 16th birthday party, his parents allowed him to try champagne, though, as he admitted, he and his friends had already experimented with brandy before. But that no longer mattered. Iris drank too much and eventually passed out in his bed. When the guests left, he found her asleep in his room. At this point, Stephen hesitated and didn't continue. A few months later, her family moved to Denver. Her father was a businessman, and they frequently relocated. They lost touch for years until, by chance, he found her on social media. Their connection rekindled, and eventually they got married. For a long time, they couldn't have children, and it wasn't until they were nearly 30 that Kyle was born. But soon after his birth, Iris fell ill. They fought, hoped, but the disease was relentless. 2 years ago, she was gone. Stephen fell silent, lost in thought. I wasn't sure why he was telling me all this. A strange unease settled over me. My fingers still unconsciously gripped my torn shirt, trying to cover myself. Unable to bear the discomfort any longer, I softly asked if I could change clothes. But before I could step away, Stephen suddenly grabbed my hand, as if afraid I would leave. There was tension in his eyes. "Wait," he said. I haven't told you the most important part yet." He paused, gathering his thoughts, then continued. "Before she died, Iris confessed something she had kept secret her entire life. She had given birth to a daughter. She had been too afraid to tell him earlier. Afraid of the consequences. Afraid that she wouldn't be able to give the child a future. And so, she did the only thing she believed was possible." Stephen's voice dropped lower, as if the weight of the memories was pressing against his throat. He explained that Iris's parents had given her a harsh ultimatum. Either she gave up the baby at birth, or they would disown her. She was only 16 at the time, and she had no real choice. He didn't blame her for it. Knowing she didn't have much time left, Iris finally confessed what she had done. She reminded him of a small cross, a gift from her grandmother, that she had always worn and never taken off. That was the very cross she had placed around her newborn daughter's neck, hoping it would protect her for the rest of her life. Stephen took a deep breath and looked me straight in the eyes. "So, Jane, it looks like I'm your father." He apologized, admitting that he had never imagined I could be found. All he had known was that his daughter had been born in Denver, but which orphanage she had ended up in, what name she had been given, or who she had become, that had remained a mystery. He had never even considered that the cross might still be with me. Almost instinctively, my fingers brushed over it. "How could I not wear it?" I whispered. "It's the only gift I have from my mother." As I flipped through the pages of the album, I saw their entire story unfold. Childhood photos, school memories, class parties, their wedding, Kyle's birth. And in every picture of Iris as a teenager, the same black silk cord was visible around her neck. In later photos, it was gone, replaced by a delicate gold chain. I studied my mother's face, her kind eyes, her warm smile. It was hard to believe she had given up her child. But she had only been a teenager, trapped by circumstances she couldn't control. Amidst the weight of these realizations, a sudden thought sparked in my mind. I turned to Stephen, a flicker of unexpected joy in my expression. "So, that means Kyle is my real brother?" Stephen smirked, shaking his head. "You surprise me. The fact that I'm your father seems to have affected you less than finding out you have a brother." I gave him a sheepish smile. "I'm sorry. It's just so unexpected." A small laugh escaped me as I realized how I had reacted. The whole situation felt surreal. Almost instinctively, I apologized and addressed Stephen as Dad for the first time. The word felt unfamiliar on my tongue, yet warm, almost comforting. He smiled, and I could tell something significant was shifting inside him, too. I tried to explain that I barely knew him yet, but with Kyle, it was different. We had already bonded, and he had become so important to me. Stephen let out a deep sigh of relief. Everything in his voice, his posture, and his expression suggested that from this moment on, life was going to change. He was firm in his decision. He would enroll me in university to study restaurant management. As for Margaret, she would be sent to mandatory treatment. Her addiction had spiraled out of control, and he now realized he should have made this decision long ago. With a small sigh, he admitted that now he would have to find a new chef. He even confessed that I had been doing an excellent job, which would make replacing me difficult. I hesitated for a moment before suggesting that I could stay on as the family's cook. I genuinely enjoyed it, and besides, it would save money. His reaction was immediate and uncompromising. Saving money on me was out of the question. After everything I had endured growing up in an orphanage, he was determined that I wouldn't lack anything. As I stepped out of the office, a group of children raced noisily down the hallway, their shouts echoing like a stadium crowd. One of them, passing by, deliberately tugged at my arm in a way that his mother wouldn't notice. I sighed with relief. Good thing I didn't get the job. The next house was nearby, so I decided to walk. The residential area was well maintained, the sun reflected off perfectly cleaned windows, the wind played with the fresh green leaves, and the air was filled with a crisp, invigorating scent. I stopped in front of ornate wrought iron gates, preparing myself for a new encounter. His mind was made up. I would study. And there was one more thing. He insisted that I move upstairs, closer to the family. He wasn't willing to lose any more time. He wanted to truly get to know me. I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could speak, he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. For a second, I froze. Then, something inside me shifted. The emptiness I had carried for so long, the quiet, aching loneliness, began to fill. I stopped at the gate, taking in the house, when a man approached me. He looked to be about 35, well-groomed and confident. It turned out he was the owner himself. He led me inside, offered me a seat, and asked if I wanted something to drink. I declined tea and coffee but asked for a glass of water, explaining that I enjoyed walking. He asked the maid to bring it while he began asking about my age, work experience, and place of residence. I admitted that I lived in a dormitory because I was an orphan. He gave me a sympathetic look and mentioned that many of their household staff had worked there for years. Perhaps I, too, would find a place there. Then he introduced himself as Stephen Walton. I told him my name was Jane Winterson, a surname given to me in the orphanage because I had been brought there in winter. Where my first and middle names came from, I had no idea. I handed him a folder with my documents, and he began studying them carefully. As he flipped through the papers, his eyes lingered on an old orphanage photograph of me, where I looked like a curly-haired angel. Then he glanced at my diploma, and a hint of approval crossed his face. He explained that their family was small, but I would be responsible for cooking not only for them, but also for the household staff. Then he nodded to the maid, Nina, instructing her to explain everything to me. A contract was placed in front of me. I skimmed through it quickly and signed without hesitation. With a slight smile, the owner mentioned that I could move in right away. Their house had been without a chef for 3 days, and they had been relying on takeout. The household included his wife, Margaret, a young but strict woman, their 5-year-old son, Kyle, his nanny, and the maid, who also assisted in the kitchen when needed. There was also a gardener who doubled as a groundskeeper, security guard, and maintenance worker for the property. He lived in a small house in the yard. As for me, I was given a cozy room near the kitchen, and I eagerly got to work. According to my contract, I had to organize full 3-course meals daily. I considered the preferences of my employers and also prepared meals for the estate staff. The kitchen was equipped with the latest appliances, even a dishwasher, which made things much easier. The maid, Nina, often helped me, especially when it came to unloading groceries or polishing silverware and glasses until they gleamed. However, I rarely saw the owners themselves. Margaret and Kyle had their meals upstairs, and the maid would bring their food to them. Margaret worked as the chief editor of a major publishing house, so she and her husband would leave in the morning, return around 5 in the evening for lunch, rest a little, and then leave again until late at night. One day, while standing with my back to the open kitchen door, I suddenly felt someone's gaze on me. Turning around, I saw a little boy,